So let's get started. Okay, so next week will be our second week of Benjamin before we turn to postmodernism in the last several weeks. So in particular, we'll be talking about Benjamin on history. So the main reading for next week is Benjamin's On the Concept of History. Paralipomena are kind of adjunct to that, meaning that's the unincorporated parts of the concept of history. The other major reading that we have is Nietzsche's On Truth and Lie in an Extramoral Sense, and on the Use and Abuse of History for Life. So on the Use and Abuse of History for Life, that's long, it's on the long end. So pace yourself, although it's a much more straightforward reading than the Benjamin. Benjamin will be responding to the Nietzsche, and that's why we're reading this. This On Truth and Lie in an Extramoral Sense, very short little excerpt from Nietzsche. So those are the two main readings, but we'll focus a lot on Benjamin's On the Concept of History. Yeah. So any volunteers for, this is also sometimes known as the Theses on the Philosophy of History by Benjamin. It's the more famous term. Okay, one. You conscripting? Okay, thanks guys. Okay. That's sometimes how it has to be done. You have to conscript your friend into it. Okay, good. Now, we have some notes posted for this week. Let's start with a little bit of an overview. So I think that we've talked about this history before, but let me refresh on some of this. We talked about it in the case of Marx when we read the 1844 manuscripts and the Communist Manifesto. But just to clue us into Benjamin's language, his terminology, his historical references, for the main reading we did for today, which is the Paris of the Second Empire in Baudelaire. So the French Revolution gives us the First Republic, and then the First Empire, or simply Republic and Empire. There's a Restoration monarchy, of the old royal family, the Bourbon, after the defeat of Napoleon in 1814 and 1815. Then there's the July Revolution and monarchy, the July monarchy, that we talked about previously when we read Heine on the Solana of 1831, and we looked at Delacroix's Liberty, Leading the People. Then we discussed previously how this cycle of boom and bust from the 1830s to the 1840s set the stage for the revolutions of 1848. So these are known as the Spring of the Peoples, or nations. So France and Germany especially, but also other parts of Europe. So there's the uprising in Vienna as well. It affects many countries in Europe. The revolutions of 1848, the important part from the Marxist perspective about the revolutions of 1848 is that they are failures. So unlike the French Revolution of 1789 and the July Revolution of 1830, the revolutions of 1848 are a failure in France and in Germany. They're more obviously a failure in Germany and in Vienna, but in France, even though the revolution is successful, it brings about the Second Republic. still there's enough turmoil that it ultimately leads to the Second Empire. And that Second Empire lasts until the Franco-Prussian War, which is followed by the Paris Commune in 1871. So this Second Empire lasts 20 years, basically between 1852 and 1871. The Second Republic only lasts as long as the first term, the one-term limit of Louis Bonaparte as president of the Second Republic. And so let's, we'll get to that, backtrack a little bit. So the July monarchy, the Orleans, Louis Philippe Orleans, bourgeois king, citizen king, regicide king. So he's from the Orleans side of the family, of the royal family. When Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were tried and put to death for betraying the revolution, one cousin, the Orleans heir, said, that's fine. They betrayed the revolution. They should be executed. So he's also known, Louis Philippe Orleans, the July monarchy, the regicide king. It's a constitutional monarchy. It's not the Restoration monarchy. It's a constitutional monarchy, but there is a change that is exemplified by choosing the Orleans over the Bourbon. It's also significant that the tricolor flag from the original French Revolution, the blue, white, and red tricolor, French tricolor, had been replaced by the Bourbon flag, which is the white flag in the Restoration monarchy. But that tricolor flag from the French Revolution that represents liberty, equality, and fraternity, blue for liberty, white for equality, red for fraternity, comes back with the July monarchy. So they bring back the revolutionary flag. And that remains the flag of the Second Republic and the Second Empire in the post-1848 period. So just as the tricolor flag had remained the flag of not only the First Republic, but the First Empire. So there's continuity here. So what is the problem leading to the revolutions of 1848? Plutocracy, so the rule of money, the corruption of the state, the corruption of society. For instance, the corruption of the art market. We might have spoken about this when we read Daniel Sherman early in the semester, that they have this national exhibit, the Salon, it's government sponsored. They have a government-appointed jury. This is the National Painting Exhibit. And so it's a worldwide event, meaning people travel from all over the world to see the paintings of the Salon. It's also a mass cultural event. So people from all over France and Europe come, and people certainly in Paris go to see the paintings. The paintings are covered in the newspaper, so there are kind of cartoon versions of the paintings that are reproduced with discussion of them in the newspaper. But that salon is seen as corrupted by moneyed interest because the art market was already distorting which artists were in and out of the jury selection at the salon. That's because people bought paintings as investments, the way people buy artworks as investments now. And to maintain the value of contemporary art as an investment, you have to maintain the public profile of the artist. Right, so people who were connected, who had money, this affected how the paintings were selected for the national exhibition. It's so prestigious. So it's the rule of money. The bust, the hungry 1840s, the global depression of the 1840s coming at the end of the Industrial Revolution. Keep in mind the Industrial Revolution, dating it from 1750 to 1850. So for Marx, this is the advent of capitalism. Capitalism first in England and then on the continent after the French Revolution. So in Western Europe, capitalism takes hold after the French Revolution. This is the big crisis of industrial capitalism in the 1840s and early 40s. I say all this because Benjamin's approach in his essay is very Marxist in terms of the background for it. Nonetheless, he's thematizing it in particular way. Now, we have talked about Baudelaire previously as the originator of the concept of modernity. It's a word that he coined. So, different from simply the modern. Modern just means current, means now, present as opposed to the past. Modernity means what is new and different, unique, specific about right now, namely the 19th century, and that is industrial capitalism. And then modernism, which is not a term that he uses, but he is nonetheless the originator of modernism both in theory and in practice. As a writer, as a literary writer, as a poet, and also as a critic. So modernism is the response that he thought writers and artists are obliged to have in the face of this new condition of modernity. So the three sections of the essay that we read for today, the Bohème, Bohemian, the Flaneur, and modernity, we'll see how modernity is the combination of the Bohemian and the Flaneur as the sort of background, as the kind of pre-1848 background or pre-1840s background for modernity. And then how Baudelaire both continues and changes those earlier phenomena. The phenomenon of Bohemianism, the phenomenon of Flaneurism. So when we read Heinrich Heine earlier in the semester, I mentioned that Heine is an important kind of forerunner for Baudelaire, and so a comparison, contrast between Heine and Baudelaire is instructive because it does show a great deal of continuity, but it also shows some important change. Heine, who was also a poet and also a critic, a literary critic and a visual art critic. And also, by the way, Heine was an acquaintance of Hegel and Marx. So Hegel is an in-between generation, and we also knew Marx when Marx went to Paris, because that's where Heine was living as an exile, as an emigre, as a Bohemian. So, Bohemianism means political or cultural emigration. So it's named after Bohemia, a province in Central Europe, German-speaking. And why did Bohemia get its name from that place? Because a large number of people from Central Europe fled the Restoration at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, at the end of the French Revolutionary era. So they fled because they were too radical, or even just too liberal, too democratically minded, to be able to tolerate the political repression of the Restoration in Europe. So they fled to places like Paris, Brussels, Amsterdam, London, and New York. Marx also followed that path. Marx was a Bohemian in this respect. He was kicked out of Germany in the 1840s. And he spent some time in Paris and then in Brussels and ended up in London, and he almost ended up in the United States. He wouldn't have ended up in New York, he went to go to Texas, of all places. But he would have gone to Texas via New York in any event. think the reason he would have gone to Texas is that there were other emigres. There were a lot of German emigres after 1848 in the United States, and they did settle the West, basically. They were part of that going west in the mid-19th century. They were the Red 48ers. And in fact, I'll say something that the German radical emigres, so a lot of them were in fact socialists and communists, many of them were just liberals and Democrats. They formed an important core of the new Republican Party that rose up, the Abolitionist Party and the Progressive Party, that came out of the Whig Party and opposed the Democratic Party. And then, of course, that led to the Civil War. So the election of Lincoln precipitated the Civil War. He was the first Republican Party president. Everyone knew what that meant. That means that that's why the Civil War was precipitated. The Republican Party was the Labor Party. It was also where the utopian socialists ended up in American politics, and where these Red 48ers ended up. And Marx wrote a great deal. Some of the readings that Benjamin is quoting were written for the New York Tribune, which was the Republican Party newspaper in the United States. So Marx wrote for the main Republican Party newspaper in the United States in this period, in the 1850s, after 1848. So Marx is also a Bohemian, Baudelaire is a Bohemian, not from a different country, but from within France. He's a Bohemian in the sense that people in the United States are Bohemians, meaning you leave your family, you leave the suburbs, you leave the country, you go to the city because you're like a radical or a dissident or something. But culturally, politically, something. You settle in Bohemia. Artists settle in Bohemia. We read Trotsky. So Bohemia has too narrow a social base. The other point about Bohemia, it's a conspiratorial milieu. It's where a lot of revolutionary exiles are living, and they maintain their political radicalism, and they do so more or less secretly, kind of underground. And Louis Bonaparte, who is the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, who was elected in 1848, he is from this milieu. He is a utopian socialist. He spends some time outside of France because of the political heat in France, in London, in fact. And so he's from this same milieu that Marx and Baudelaire and Proudhon and also Gustave Courbet, the same bohemian atmosphere, the same bohemian milieu they occupy together. So to have a Bohemian elected president in the Second Republic, that's a major significance to Bonapartism, what we're going to be talking about, at least from some of the political background. So the events of 1848 that Benjamin makes reference to, these are important as well. So the revolution of 1848 in France, it began with the February Revolution, which is the overthrow of the monarchy and the establishment of the provisional government. And in the provisional government, they had a socialist minister, Louis Blanc, and he established what was known as the National Workshops, which was a public works program to put unemployed people to work. That public works program, the National Workshops, were canceled because they couldn't fund them, because they couldn't raise the taxes. They also couldn't raise the international money. They floated a loan, kind of a bond offering, French sovereign debt bond offering on the international financial market, and it was shut down. And so they canceled the national workshops. When they did that, the working class in Paris rose up in June of 1848 and was crushed in a horrific massacre. There's actually a painting that depicts this. The Barricade by Meissonier. So this is the corollary, the contrast to the liberty reading the people It was criticized by people at the time. They called it an omelet of men because of the way the bodies are just all scrambled together. It's an important painting in the history of realism in painting, like Delacroix's Liberty Leading People, Meissonier's Barricade. And it was meant by Meissonier as like a conservative political warning against the people rising up. So it's kind of like, people don't rise up or this will happen to you. But it was seen by people as a protest against the brutality of the suppression of the uprising. So again, the similarity and difference with Liberty Leading People is significant. So June 1848, very shocking, traumatic event in the Revolution of 1848. The general who led the effort to put down the uprising was Cavaignac. And he is the Liberals' candidate for president in the election of December 1848. He's the one who Louis Bonaparte defeats in that election. It's Cavaignac. And he defeats Cavaignac also on the basis of saying, the liberals have betrayed the revolution. I'm representing the people. I'm representing the workers and the peasants against the liberal bourgeoisie who are betraying the revolution. So on the resentment of the crushing of the June days of 1848, in part, he's elected president. And then he's in a constant conflict during the Second Republic, which has a one-term limit on the president. He's in a constant struggle because 1848 they instituted universal male suffrage for the first time, no property requirement for the vote, and it elected Bonaparte. So then immediately the National Assembly tries to scale back the franchise not by reestablishing a property requirement, but more cunningly by establishing a residency requirement. Meaning you have to have lived someplace for a certain amount of time in order to be able to register to vote in that district. And that is meant to exclude working class and poor farmers who have to move around for work. So when Louis Bonaparte has his coup d'etat in 1851, he does so in order to save the revolution, save democracy against the betrayal of the liberal bourgeoisie. And he has a lot of popular support for doing so. And he arms the workers in Paris to suppress the bourgeoisie in his coup d'etat. And he establishes the Second Empire, which lasts for 20 years. So very popular. It has a popular mandate, and he has plebiscites to continue to ratify it. So he has a plebiscite after the coup d'etat. Do you support this? The people say yes. He does another one to renew the empire after 10 years, and they say yes to that. And of course, his plebiscites are all rigged and corrupt, but nonetheless, there is popular support. And in that time of the Second Empire, Louis Bonaparte rebuilds Paris and also modernizes France more generally. So we know the rebuilding of Paris under the Second Empire through haussmanns, the boulevards. So those are depicted in the painting that is sort of a kind of emblematic painting of the Art Institute of Chicago, namely the Caillebotte. How am I forgetting how to spell his name? The Rainy Day. Right, this depicts the boulevards. This is all new construction. You can actually see that there's construction going on in the painting. You can see some scaffolding. So they tore up the old medieval streets, and which were kind of winding mess, and they created these like clear, broad boulevards, like a quasi-grid system with diagonal cross streets. That's the new Paris, which is also a kind of a slum-clearing operation. So they displace the working class in the suburbs. So in Europe, the pattern of urbanization is very different than in the United States, especially in the post-60s United States, because in Europe, the city is for the rich people, and the suburbs is for poor people. So poor people live in the suburbs, rich people live in the city. They've done a little bit of that in Chicago. They've displaced the working class to the so-called collar suburbs. And we'll see what Baudelaire makes of that in some of his poetry. One thing I'll say about the Caillebotte painting, so he's considered an impressionist painter. Even though this is not what typical impressionism. Nonetheless, it is impressionism, and part of that has to do with the treatment of the pictorial plane of the painting, meaning there's a homogeneous picture plane, what we talked about with photography, and meaning there's this would be mistaken for like photorealism or something, which is another way of thinking about it. But he is playing with certain graphical, compositional aspects of the painting, one of which is to violate a cardinal rule, which is that you're not supposed to have just a symmetrical field division like this with this lamppost, because when you do that with a painting, when you cut it exactly in half like that, it actually makes the painting feel more imbalanced. So you're supposed to sort of make it a little bit on one side or on the other side in order to give it more of a sense of balance. So what this does is it unbalances the painting and sort of sets it in motion. So there's a kind of tension here between stasis and motion, and where people are seemingly walking in various different directions. Like there's a kind of a chaos to the various strollers. So this is something that we'll talk about with flaneur on the boulevard. And each either single person or pair of people is sort of in their own little world on the street. So they're kind of out in public, but they're also very much in their private interior states. And that includes their kind of outward gaze, which is also kind of an inward gaze, meaning part of what's going on here is the depiction of how we look at people and things in the city. We look at things without like really looking at them, or we look at other people without them thinking that we're looking at them. We kind of look past through people even though we're looking at them. We don't really meet the gaze of other people, even make eye contact, right? That kind of bizarre experience of the city that we've naturalized but was brand new in the 19th century. Meaning for the first time in the 19th century, it was an everyday occurrence to encounter people that you didn't know and that you weren't going to know. Right, so there were cities before, but people stayed in their neighborhoods, and so everyone knew each other. In the post-industrial city, we have this kind of anonymous crowd, something that we'll talk about. But I just made mention of that because this painting captures something of the abiding flaneur character of modernity. Okay, so what's I want to say about this? Baudelaire is a controversial poet. So he's an influential art critic, very influential art and literary critic, but he's a controversial poet in a way that might be obscure to us now. His book is suppressed several times, it's subject to obscenity trials, and that's not only a function of the content. So there is some kind of weird sexual content, especially there's an objection to the depiction of lesbianism. That's considered obscene. But really, what rubs people the wrong way about Baudelaire's poetry that we might not appreciate as readily in English translation, nor as post-20th century people, that Baudelaire combines kind of traditional poetic language and a kind of elevated tone with vulgar expressions and words. So he writes traditional verse, he writes in traditional rhyme and meter, but so the musicality of the poetry is there, and is very well done and kind of flawless. But through that musicality, he actually blurs the distinction between the elevated and the perfect. And so not just at the level of subject matter or imagery, but also at the level of the language itself. There seems to be a kind of a profanation of poetry itself in Baudelaire's writing as a poet. Okay, so Gabriel, I see that you made some comment on the To the Bourgeoisie, the Heroism of Modern Life, the 1846 Salon Criticism. So let's take a look at this in some detail. So the first thing, we've talked about this previously when we talked about Marx, but let's remind ourselves that the term bourgeois, it doesn't have the connotation that we nowadays associate with it. So we tend to think of bourgeois as like bougie, like rich people, or we might also, I think more rarely nowadays, think of it in terms of a kind of middle class Philistinism, where we think of it as like very specific. In terms of a sociological or socioeconomic category. The use of the term is broader than that, and it is a French term, and it just means urban. So it means the city folk, it means the town folk, it means the city dwellers, the city people as opposed to the country people. And in that respect, it means modern, because it means the society in which the city is the center of life, of productive life, of the economy, also therefore of politics. And so bourgeois society means all the people of the city, all the people of the town. As opposed to the traditional civilization of the countryside, the peasants, the parish priest, the lords of the manor, the village artisans, to the city as a new kind of social life that emerged in the Renaissance and developed up through the 19th century and still today. So the dedication he has to the Salon of 1846 is peculiar. To the bourgeoisie, so he says, you are the majority in both number and intelligence, and therefore you are the force, which is justice. So he means that very literally, you are the majority in number and intelligence. So the city is seen as more sophisticated than the country, but that is an all-inclusive urban city folk, town dweller. I mentioned the salon. So the salon's a mass cultural event. The working class goes to the salon. It's a mass cultural event. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people go through to look at the paintings. Some are scholars, he writes, others are owners. A glorious day will come when the scholars shall be owners and the owners scholars. Then your power will be complete and no man will protest against it. Now, we talked about this with the 1844 manuscripts of Marx, property. So the John Locke idea of the three fundamental rights, the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and property. And that property was based not on possession, not on just prior occupancy, like might means right. So the right of the feudal aristocrat to the land is because his ancestors conquered it. No, John Locke said no, property is based on labor, meaning the owners of the land are the farmers who work it, not the aristocrat whose family conquered it. So work is seen as the source of property, the source of ownership. How do people have ownership in things? Through their labor. Now, it's a little bit of a pre-industrial perspective that Baudelaire is expressing here, meaning in the pre-industrial revolution working class, the workers own their tools. They own their labor, they own their labor power. They could sell their labor through an employment contract, but they also own the means of production. They own their own skills, they own their own tools. With the Industrial Revolution, the machines are not owned by the workers. That's the big shift that happens. And also, as Marx wrote in the 1844 manuscripts, workers become alienated from their labor. So their labor is their property, but also it's alienated from them in capitalism. So capital is alienated labor or estranged labor. So again, this is not something that Baudelaire is particularly keen to. He's aware of socialism and its call to abolish private property, but he's just assuming the normal bourgeois values in this instance. So he says, until that supreme harmony between owners and scholars is achieved, it is just that those who are but owners should aspire to become scholars, for knowledge is no less of an enjoyment than ownership. The government of the city is in your hands, and that is just, for you are the force. But you must also be capable of feeling beauty, for as not one of you today can do without power, so not one of you has the right to do without poetry. You can live 3 days without bread, without poetry never. And those of you who say the contrary are mistaken, they are out of their minds. The aristocrats of thought, the distributors of praise and blame, the monopolists of the things of the mind, have told you that you have no right to feel and to enjoy. They are Pharisees. For you have in your hands the government of a city whose public is the public of the universe, and it is necessary that you should be worthy of that task. All right, so again, bourgeois society, the modern city, is a cosmopolitan place. Its public is the public of the universe. It's not just a local public. We talked about this with T.J. Clark and his definition of modernism as a bourgeois art without a bourgeois public. But again, Baudelaire is just articulating the more bourgeois humanistic perspective of cosmopolitan universalism. Enjoyment is a science, and the exercise of the five senses calls for a particular initiation which only comes about through goodwill and need. Very well, you need art. Art is an infinitely precious good, a draught both refreshing and cheering, which restores the stomach and the mind to the natural equilibrium of the ideal. You understand its functions, you gentlemen of the bourgeoisie, whether lawgivers or businessmen. When the 7th or the 8th hour strikes and you bend your tired head towards the embers of your hearth and the cushions of your armchair, that is the time when a keener desire and a more active reverie would refresh you after your daily labors. But the monopolists have decided to keep the forbidden fruit of knowledge from you because knowledge is their counter and their shop, and they are infinitely jealous of it. If they had merely denied you the power to create works of art or to understand the processes by which they are created, they would have asserted a truth at which you could not take offense, because public business and trade take up 3/4 of your day. And as for your leisure hours, they should be used for enjoyment and pleasure. But the monopolists have forbidden you even to enjoy, because you do not understand the technique of the arts as you do those of the law and business. But yet it is just that if 2/3 of your time are devoted to knowledge, then the remaining third should be occupied by feeling. And it is by feeling alone that art is to be understood. And it is in this way that the equilibrium of your soul's forces will be established. Truth, for all its multiplicity, is not two-faced. And just as in your politics you have increased both rights and benefits, so in the arts you have set up a greater and more abundant communion. You, the bourgeois, be you king, lawgiver, or businessman, have founded collections, museums, and galleries. Some of those which 16 years ago were only open to the monopolists, so that's before the 1830 July Revolution, have thrown wide their doors to the multitude. You have combined together, you have formed companies and raised loans in order to realize the idea of the future in all its varied forms, political, industrial, and artistic. In no noble enterprise have you ever left the initiative to the protesting and suffering minority, the Republican faction, which anyway is the natural enemy of art. For to allow oneself to be outstripped in art and in politics is to commit suicide, and for a majority to commit suicide is impossible. Now, interestingly, it turns out that a socialist despairing in the period of the Second Empire came up with the idea that the way to stop capitalism is to have the working class commit mass suicide. But that would bring about an end to capitalism. Anyway, because surely it would. And what you have done for France, you have done for other countries too. The Spanish Museum is there to increase the volume of general ideas that you ought to possess about art. For you know perfectly well that just as a national museum is a kind of communion by whose gentle influence men's hearts are softened and their wills unbent, so a foreign museum is an international communion where two peoples, observing and studying one another more at their ease, can penetrate one another's mind and fraternize without discussion. You are the natural friends of the arts because you are some of you rich men and others scholars. When you have given to society your knowledge, your industry, your labor, and your money, you claim back your payment and enjoyments of the body, the reason, and the imagination. If you recover the amount of enjoyments which is needed to establish the equilibrium of all parts of your being, then you are happy, satisfied, and well-disposed, as society will be satisfied, happy, and well-disposed when it has found its own general and absolute equilibrium. And so it is to you, the bourgeois, that this book is naturally dedicated, for any book which is not addressed to the majority in number and intelligence is a stupid book. Okay, so let's see, what do we make of this? Gabe, did you want to say anything about your notes here?
I hope I got it right. I was just saying I thought the language in it was really different than the way Marx would talk about the bourgeois, that it was kind of like really complimentary, trying to gas them up a bit, saying that their labors are how art is made possible, and that they have every right to enjoy it and should be taking more stock into not needing to understand the art to enjoy it necessarily, that you can find leisure and enjoyment, something that you might not comprehend fully.
Right, especially at the level of production. Right, so he's kind of accepting a distinction between consumption and production. And he's saying that art has to be useful. So one of the things that Benjamin points out in his essay is that Baudelaire is not a l'art pour l'art or art for art's sake person. He does think that art should be useful to people. So in that way, he's not like Gautier, who we read earlier in the semester. He's not an aesthete in that way. Although he is commonly mistaken for one. Baudelaire is commonly seen in these terms as a kind of l'art pour l'art aesthete, who's sort of rebelling against the market and the utility of art. No, in fact, part of the pathos of Baudelaire is that he really wanted, he's ambivalent about it, he's kind of resentful of not getting it, but he wants popular readership, he does. But like I said, it's kind of deeply ambivalent about that, and his readership is fraught, meaning he is one of the first examples of someone whose writing is more famous after his death than during his lifetime. So he's, kind of exemplar of modernism in that sense of posthumous appreciation and fame. Although he is influential in his own time, he is nonetheless more resonant with people after his death. So society became more Baudelairean after Baudelaire's own lifetime. So he's a kind of a forerunner in this sense. Actually, he is avant-garde in the way that Greenberg defined avant-garde. Now we will see, I mention this because Benjamin has a counterexample to Baudelaire, and that's Victor Hugo. Victor Hugo is the kitsch, and Baudelaire is the avant-garde, to use Greenberg's categories. Hugo is the kitsch. And we know Hugo from Les Mis, from Les Miserables. We know him from the Broadway musical. We know him from the movie version. So these are adaptations of what was a novel. So Les Miserables is a novel by Hugo. Hugo is like Baudelaire, a poet, but he also is a fiction writer, and he is also a critic, both a literary critic and an art critic, as well as a political commentator. Hugo is more of a political commentator than Baudelaire was, in fact. Baudelaire was much more ironical and stood apart from politics. So again, like Greenberg pointed out in Avant-Garde and Kitsch, the separation of the political avant-garde from the cultural and artistic and literary avant-garde. So Marx would be the political avant-garde. Baudelaire is the artistic avant-garde. And we also talked about Courbet, who's a close acquaintance of Baudelaire and also of Proudhon, the anarchist socialist. Now I raised Hugo, Les Mis, now Hugo is associated with realism. So we have, in this period, the emergence of what would be much more of an opposition in the 20th century, namely between realism and modernism. So we have sort of two outgrowths of Romanticism that are parallel. So we have, on the one hand, they complement each other, on the other hand, they oppose each other. So realism and modernism are parallel developments out of Romanticism. We've addressed the way realism emerged from Romanticism via the Delacroix, the liberty of the people. Delacroix straddles that transition between Romanticism and realism. And modernism we associate more with Manet, but also with Courbet. Courbet, again, this distinction that Greenberg made between Courbet being the first avant-garde painter and Manet being the first modernist painter. In fact, they're closely related, and Manet was deeply influenced by both Courbet and Baudelaire. Hugo is associated with literary realism. So he's associated with, like Les Mis is in the same category as the novels of Balzac, who we read part of one of his novels, and Charles Dickens. So I'll just point out Les Mis. So the Trump campaign in 2016, they used Can You Hear the People Sing from Les Mis as rallies. And they even had some crazy version, like adaptation of Liberty Leading the People by Delacroix, with like him and his like acolytes in the role of the people rising up. Right? So this is kitsch politics, kitsch art, kitsch literature. Kitsch. And in fact, kitsch leading to fascism in the 20th century, although I don't like the association of Trumpism and fascism because I think it's too simplistic and too tendentious and too pro-democratic party propaganda. But anyway, in the 20th century, Marxists would raise socialist realism as a principle in the 1930s, where Benjamin is writing. As opposed to modernism, modernism is seen as bourgeois decadence. So it's individualistic, formalistic, antisocial. Baudelaire would be condemned by most Marxists as bourgeois decadent. His modernism would be condemned. Whereas Victor Hugo would be seen as an artist on the side of the people, doing social realism, depicting the working class, the downtrodden, the oppressed, in a positive light against the corruption of the powers that be. So Hugo would be seen as good, and Baudelaire would be seen as bad. And he means cutting against that. Meaning that he thinks that Hugo is obscuring what capitalism is, whereas Baudelaire is presenting it in all of its deep contradiction and fundamental ambivalence. Whereas Hugo is sort of romanticizing the subaltern, romanticizing the working class and the underclass, in fact. Now, I will also say about Hugo that Hugo wrote, excuse me, a condemnation of Louis Bonaparte. So both Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, the anarchist socialist, and Victor Hugo wrote books on on Bonaparte in the wake of Louis Bonaparte's coup d'etat, the 18th Brumaire is what Marx called it, harking back to the time of the French Revolution and Napoleon. But Hugo treated Louis Bonaparte as a bolt from the blue, as an accident of history, as a kind of monstrous kind of crime. So he the way he put it was that like Bonaparte sort of raped France by taking power, condemned Bonaparte. Proudhon, by contrast, wrote about Bonaparte that he was an expression of historical necessity. That capitalist society and modern society had kind of determined Louis Bonaparte and Bonapartism in the Second Empire as a historical necessity. And in fact, Proudhon even flirted with the idea of trying to make an alliance of the working class and socialists with Louis Bonaparte's regime against the capitalist class, against the capitalist bourgeoisie. So Baudelaire, on the other hand, has a more ironical attitude about the whole thing, about the Revolution of 1848, about the Second Republic, and about the Second Empire, and about Bonapartism. Again, more distant from the political world, whereas Hugo is more engaged with the political world. So it seems to be a more socially responsible writer than Baudelaire. Right, so all the language that we have now, like social responsibility, social justice, Hugo would be on the side of that. Baudelaire would seem to stand apart or even in opposition to that. So Baudelaire's definitely pushing an agenda in addressing his society in that way and the powers that be in that society in the way that he does. Is he just sucking up to them? I mean, it could be seen that way. It could certainly be seen that way. But he's also wanting art and literature to be appropriate to this society and to the ruling spirit and powers of that society. Right, so he says the majority in number and intelligence, and you are the force that is justice. Right, so he's kind of saying, who am I as a writer or a critic to oppose what is clearly, the spirit of the time. And that's where the heroism of modern life comes in. And this is where he really articulates his breaking from romanticism and the emergence of a modernist criterion in terms of art and literary criticism, meaning that things have changed. And because things have changed, people have changed, and sensibilities have changed, and art and literature must change to meet that new situation. So he addresses it. Many people will attribute the present decadence in painting to our decadence in behavior. Now, what does he mean by decadence here? So there's romanticism, but there's also the apparent corruption of art and literature an institutionalized romanticism, an academicized romanticism, kind of an official style of romanticism. We had in Heine the description of what he called the David school, and that is exemplified by Ancre, and we looked at the portrait of Monsieur Bertin when we looked at the Heine, the pecuniary expression of the person sitting for a portrait. The dogma of the studios, which has gained currency among the public, is a poor excuse of the artists, for they had a vested interest in ceaselessly depicting the past. It is an easier task and one that could be turned to good account by the lazy. So again, a kind of institutionalized or academicized romanticism had bred a kind of laziness among the artists. And nonetheless, he says it is true that the great tradition has been lost and that the new one is not yet established. But what was this great tradition, if not a habitual, everyday idealization of ancient life? A robust and martial form of life, a state of readiness on the part of each individual, which gave him a habit of gravity in his movements and of majesty or violence in his attitudes. To this should be added a public splendor which found its reflection in private life. Ancient life was a great parade. It ministered above all to the pleasure of the eye, and this day-to-day paganism has marvelously served the arts. So if we think about the 18th century painting, 1700s in the realm of painting, and just life in the 17th century in general, it's colorful by contrast with the 19th century. There is a kind of bourgeoisification of the aristocracy. There's also an aristocratization of the bourgeoisie in the period of absolutism in the 17th and 18th centuries. Before trying to distinguish the epic side of modern life, and before bringing examples to prove that our age is no less fertile in sublime themes than past ages, we may assert that since all centuries and all peoples have had their own form of beauty, so inevitably we have ours. That is in the order of things. All forms of beauty, like all possible phenomena, contain an element of the eternal and an element of the transitory, of the absolute and the particular. Absolute and eternal beauty does not exist, or rather it is only an abstraction skimmed from the general surface of different beauties. The particular element in each manifestation comes from the emotions. And just as we have our own particular emotions, so we have our own beauty. So the idea is that our emotions are different than people in the past. Except for Hercules on Mount Ida, Cato of Utica, and Cleopatra, whose suicides were not modern suicides, what suicides do you find represented in the old masters? Again, this is going to be another theme that Benjamin makes mention of, not this week, but next week in the Arcades Project selections we have. It used to be that the only people who committed suicide were ruling class people. So like religious people, religious authorities, and aristocrats, and kings, monarchs. Why? Because death before dishonor. Right? To preserve the value of their principles, they would commit suicide rather than dishonor those principles. So suicide had a heroic quality. Modern society, however, is the first society in which the subaltern people are the people who are mostly committing suicide. So peasants didn't commit suicide. That wasn't really a thing. Aristocrats, yes. Priests, yes, if they were threatened with dishonor or blasphemy, but not everyday people. Modern society, on the other hand, it's your everyday people who commit suicide. Right, so this is another kind of twist he's putting on the idea of heroism and modern life. Because maybe that modern suicide that comes from the lack of meaning, so it's not about preserving meaning, it's about despairing of meaning. That might be, in some very kind of perverse way, our heroism in the face of modernity. As for the garb, the outer husk, of the modern hero, although the time is past when every little artist dressed up as a grand panjandrum and smoked pipes as long as duck rifles. Nevertheless, the studios and the world at large are still full of people who would like to poeticize Antony with the Greek cloak and a party-colored vesture. But all the same, has not this much abused garb its own beauty and its native charm? Is it not the necessary garb of our suffering age, which wears the symbol of a perpetual mourning, even upon its thin black shoulders? So in the 19th century, everyone wears black. Note, too, that the dress coat and the frock coat not only possess their political beauty, which is an expression of universal equality, but also their poetic beauty, which is an expression of the public soul, an immense cortege or funeral procession of undertakers' mutes. Mutes in love, political mutes, bourgeois mutes. We are each of us celebrating some funeral. And we looked at the Burial at Ornans by Courbet as an example of this kind of social realism, but also avant-garde painting. A uniform livery of affliction bears witness to equality. And as for the eccentrics, whose violent and contrasting colors used easily to betray them to the eye, today they are satisfied with slight nuances in design and cut, much more than in color. Look at those grinning creases which play like serpents around mortified flesh. Have they not their own mysterious grace? And again, that's where the this painting that we looked at is an example. Let not the tribes of colorists be too indignant, for if it is more difficult, their task is thereby only the more glorious. Great colorists know how to create color with a black coat, a white cravat, and a gray background. But to return to our principal and essential problem, which is to discover whether we possess a specific beauty intrinsic to our new emotions, I observe that the majority of artists who have attacked modern life have contented themselves with public and official subjects. So attacked here just means like approached at a certain angle. With our victories and our political heroism. Even so, they do it with an ill grace, and only because they are commissioned by the government which pays them. However, there are private subjects which are very much more heroic than these. The pageant of fashionable life and the thousands of floating existences, criminals and kept women, which drift about in the underworld of a great city, the Gazette des Tribunaux and the Moniteur all prove to us that we have only to open our eyes and to recognize our heroism. So the daily news items about crime in the city give us a picture of our heroism. Suppose that a spinster baited by, it's not a spinster, a minister baited by the opposition's impertinent questioning has given expression once and for all, with that proud and sovereign eloquence which is proper to him, to his scorn and disgust for all ignorant and mischief-making oppositions. The same evening you will hear the following words buzzing round on the Boulevard des Italiens. Were you in the chamber today, and did you see the minister? Good heavens, how handsome he was. I have never seen such scorn. So there are such things as modern beauty and modern heroism. And a little later, I hear that K or F has been commissioned to do a medal on the subject. But he won't know how to do it. He has no understanding for these things. So artists can be more or less fitted to understand modern beauty. The life of our city is rich in poetic and marvelous subjects. We are enveloped and steeped as though in an atmosphere of the marvelous, but we do not notice it. The nude, that darling of the artists, that necessary element of success, is just as frequent and necessary today as it was in the life of the ancients. In bed, for example, or in the bath, or in the anatomy theater. The themes and resources of painting are equally abundant and varied, but there is a new element, modern beauty. All right, to illustrate this a bit, I want to look at, we did not do this before? We did the Olympia. Did we look at Olympia? We did. Okay, so you guys know that. So we looked at the Ancre, the Grand Odalisque, as a kind of late romantic, kind of Orientalist version of trying to imitate the old masters, Titian's Venus of Urbino. And we looked at Manet as a contrasting example of trying to remake the Titian painting, but in the spirit of this new sensibility, because in fact, Manet was inspired by Baudelaire to paint his painting. And part of the criticism of Manet's painting of Olympia is that she's a man in drag. She's too androgynous. And that she's a corpse. All right, so the nude in the Anatomy Theater, that she's a corpse. There was actually a cartoon that like a caricature of this painting that was a naked man in bed. All right. So he is doing something very intentional with this painting, in trying to be true to the modern eros, modern psychology, emotion, as opposed to, in contrast with that the Renaissance, early bourgeois humanism of Titian's Venus of Urbino. And the black cat is also a little signature item that references Baudelaire, because one of Baudelaire's most famous poems in his book of poetry is called The Black Cat. And there it is. All right. Okay. Let's see. Gabriel, did you have anything that you wanted to add to your thoughts reading that? So there is what Greenberg pointed out at the end of Modernist Painting, his essay from 1960. He said that he wouldn't understand art if there wasn't continuity. So he doesn't understand modernism as breaking with the past, but rather as continuing it. But that, in fact, to continue the past, you actually do have to change. To maintain a tradition actually requires change. That if you just reiterate the past, you actually kill the tradition, you violate the tradition. All right, we had the 1855, his essay on the Universal Exposition, and we also have The Painter of Modern Life, which is a later Salon criticism. Now, again, he gets into more of the details of the new sensibility as applied to the visual arts, but also in terms of the overall social situation. So the Universal Exposition, of course, brings out the importance of technology in modern life. And so, again, he is interested in the utility of art. He's interested in the art being up to date, including at a technical level. But he also has tension with photography. So he does see photography as potentially threatening to painting, because he thinks that the popularity of photography will kind of miseducate people as to how to view works of art, how to view visual art. That we are now habituated to looking at images as if they were photographs, even though that's actually not appropriate to make them.
He thinks the photograph doesn't reflect on modern life in the same way as a painting, because there's not that emotion, essentially.
That's right. So what it does is it sort of removes the aesthetic form And by removing the aesthetic form, it removes the kind of subjectivity and the ability to reflect upon like feeling, right? That what photography does is that it gives you a kind of more of a technical kind of depiction, and so it's lacking in imagination, right? So the problem is that if photography replaces the imagination, then it robs the visual image of the ability to thematize feeling. And the irony is that photography, we talked about this when we were at Krakow and Benjamin on photography. The irony is that photography borrows sort of slavishly from the genres of easel painting, meaning the portrait, the landscape, and the still life. And photography could be used in all sorts of other ways, but tends not to be. And so, in fact, photography falls back on the tradition of painting, but in such a way as to also rob it of the work of the imagination. Right, so there's a kind of pollution of painting by photography in Baudelaire's view. And so he ends up saying that photography should be used as a drafting device rather than as making the image itself. And of course, there's a long history to this. We talked about this when we addressed photography previously, namely that the camera obscura was already used as a drafting device going back to the Renaissance. So they already used lens projection and that kind of drafting of the image, but as like a technical aid. So basically, like portions of the picture would be rendered that way, but the entire painting would not be rendered in that principle or that technique.
Exactly, like most students in academia on AI right now. I was really surprised coming back to school, especially creative school, that just automatically fail using AI. It's creative school, but in the curriculums I've seen people are like suggesting the same thing, like, oh, you can use this as a draft or put certain points in here and then rewrite it. I don't know.
Right. In other words, it's not the technology itself; it's how we use it. Right. So, the anxiety is: are we going to abandon our own, creative imagination to the kind of predigested character of the tool, of the instrument? Now, why this is important is that if we recall, avant-garde and kitsch. So AI is like the ultimate kitsch kind of device, right? Because what does it do? It synthesizes like everything that's on the internet. So it basically boils everything down to a kind of lowest common denominator. And to use Greenberg's language, it imitates the processes of art, but it imitates the avant-garde's imitation of the processes of art. Meaning, what it gives you is like the imitation of imitation, but not in a critical way, but in an affirmative way and in a kind of naturalized way. That it eternalizes it, rather than giving us a kind of window into the present. Again, modernity. And to do that, you need use of the imagination, you need to exercise judgment. So ultimately, the artist's judgment has to be determinative. Otherwise, what you're doing is just a pure exercise in conventionalism. Right. So, so AI will produce kind of academicism or will produce kitsch, but it can't really produce anything new. That's the assertion, anyway. That's the understanding. Now, of course, it does produce something new. However, we still have to make a judgment about what's meaningful or significant about what it does produce. So again, the idea, certainly Benjamin doesn't accept, we read the little history of photography, Benjamin does not accept this opposition between art and photography. He accepts that photography is art, and then in fact maybe all art has been photography. Right, so it's not that photography is going to replace art. Photography is art. The question is, how is it art? And also, how do we use it as art? What kind of art is it? What do we do with it as an art form? So certainly photographers can be artists, but they're not going to be artists just by making their photographs arty, making their photographs seem like paintings, right? Because that actually denies what photography can do that painting cannot do. Right, so photography as art would have to be able to produce something through photography that you couldn't do with painting, and vice versa. So one way of understanding, and again Greenberg raises this, if there is a relationship between photography and painting in terms of the modernist era, and photography is a creation of the realist era, the 1830s, then it's that photography frees painting to be able to explore things that photography cannot do. You know, what kind of image can painting create that photography cannot? Right. But the flip side of that is that photography should explore things that it can do that painting cannot do. And generally it hasn't done that. What photography has done is given us kind of a second-rate realist painting. Avant-garde photography, on the other hand, has tried to do something that only photography can do, but that's been the minor note throughout the history of photography. And that's seldom practiced. It's there in early photography, it's there again in the 1920s, makes come back in the 60s and 70s, and maybe a little bit into the 80s, but then it sort of dropped, and we're left in the conventional pre-digested realism, the dominance of the kitsch photography. So Baudelaire does warn us about this, but in a seemingly contradictory way. So let's talk about the painter of modern life, some of the themes there that are important for Benjamin's essay, namely his models for the comportment, the ethic of the artist. And so, the dandy, modernity, the dandy who's not the flaneur. So the flaneur is the person who strolls through the city regarding it as an external spectacle that they keep their distance from. So his example of this is like the country gentleman who visits the city and is sort of entertained by the spectacle of the city. He contrasts that with the man of the crowd, and the man of the crowd is based on Baudelaire's inspiration from Edgar Allan Poe, who's the originator of the modern detective story, the detective novel, where the man of the crowd is sort of immersed in the city, immersed in the crowd, as opposed to treating the crowd as a spectacle. Now the dandy, there's a term that we get from the English, but in fact, what Baudelaire means by dandy is a little bit different. And it is an outgrowth of Romanticism. So the dandy is the person who lives his life as if it's a work of art. So dandyism is a kind of comportment of life as self-creation, like a self-created persona, a self-created image, a self-created life. Again, this comes out of Romanticism, but is taken up by Baudelaire in terms of modernism. And his examples of dandyism are kind of peculiar. There's a term that Benjamin uses in this Paris and the Second Empire in Baudelaire that might have struck you guys as a little bit odd. The Apaches. That is what that means, the Apaches. Meaning, how did the upper class people see the lower class people in the city? As Apaches. It's because the popular literature of the time is American Westerns in France. I love reading Westerns. And so basically, just like the settlers in the Wild West are, beset by Native Americans attacking them, coming out of from behind every rock. So you have to be on your guard in the city against the poor people who are Apaches. But Baudelaire also uses the Native American warrior as a model for the dandy. Meaning the Native American warrior for whom war is an art form, and the Native American warrior paints his body and adorns his body, but as an instrument in battle. In other words, what is the garb of the Native American warrior about? It's about dazzling your opponent. It's about defeating your opponent in battle. So art, aesthetics, is inseparable from combat and war. And the dandy is on that battlefield. So the dandy is also aestheticizing himself as a kind of social weapon, or as a weapon of social combat. Now, that's part of it. The other part of it is the model for poetry and more broadly for art in general. So gambling. So art is like a roll of the dice, something that Mallarmé writes about later. One of the first free verse poems by Mallarmé is called The Roll of the Dice. Card playing, any kind of repetitive, seemingly escapist, intoxicating activity that's a cure for boredom. So the first poem in Baudelaire's Fleur de Mal to the reader is addressing this question of boredom. Let me... Sorry, these scans are rotated so that they can be printed. So, folly and error, avarice and vice employ our souls and waste our bodies' force. As mangy beggars incubate their lice, we nourish our innocuous remorse. Our sins are stubborn, craven our repentance. For our weak vows we ask excessive prices. Trusting our tears will wash away the sentence, we sneak off where the muddy road entices. Cradled in evil, that thrice great magician, the devil, rocks our souls that can't resist, and the rich metal of our own volition is vaporized by that sage alchemist. The devil pulls the strings by which we're worked. By all revolting objects lured, we slink hellwards. Each day down, one more step we're jerked, feeling no horror through the shades that stink. Just as a lustful pauper bites and kisses the scarred and shriveled breast of an old whore, we steal along the roadside, furtive blisses, squeezing them like stale oranges for more. Packed tight, like hives of maggots, thickly seething, within our brains a host of demons surges. Deep down into our lungs at every breathing, death flows, an unseen river, moaning dirges. If rape or arson, poison, or the knife has wove no pleasing patterns in the stuff of this drab canvas we accept as life, it is because we are not bold enough. Amongst the jackals, leopards, mongrels, apes, snakes, scorpions, vultures that with hellish din squeal, roar, writhe, gambol, crawl with monstrous shapes in each man's foul menagerie of sin, there's one more damned than all. He never gambols, nor crawls, nor roars, but from the rest withdrawn, gladly as of this whole earth would make a shambles and swallow up existence with a yawn. Boredom. He smokes his hookah while he dreams of gibbets, that's a scaffold where people are hung, weeping tears he cannot smother. You know this dainty monster too, it seems. Hypocrite reader, you, my twin, my brother. So meaning, he addresses the reader of his book as maybe you're reading this out of boredom. Maybe I'm just trying to entertain you in your boredom. right? So there's something essential about the sensibility of boredom, and even of the cultivation of boredom. Right? Activities that are about staving off or really thematizing boredom, killing time. Art and literature are leisure time activity. Right? They're for relaxation after work. But they're also about keeping busy, filling time. Now, I should also say about Manet's Olympia. Oh, did I close that out already? Where's Manet's Olympia? I guess I did. No. Okay. She looks bored. She's bored. Meaning prostitution is about boredom too. For both the client and the prostitute. It's a time-killing activity. She's on the clock. Boredom is even part of our erotic life. Now I'll say something about Baudelaire's, we can call it misogyny. Right, one of the phrases that he has is, I have not written my book for your wife, your daughter, your mother, your sister. So why does he say that? Because in fact that is the reading public of the time. So the people who buy and read literature, whether in the form of novels or in the form of poetry, women. Women are a major consumer of art and literature. And he kind of, he's ambivalent about that. And somewhat resentful of it. Meaning he thinks that this has something to do with why he doesn't have an audience, why he doesn't have a readership. Why he's lacking a public for his work. Right. So, he's obsessed with Georges Sand, who's a woman writer who writes under the pen name Georges Sand, a man's name, and who is herself kind of, I don't know if she's exactly gender fluid, but she dresses as a man, right? That's her kind of part of her notoriety. But she's a very popular writer, extremely popular writer. And Baudelaire's sort of obsessed with her popularity. So she and Victor Hugo and others have a marketable oeuvre that finds a public in a way that he struggled more to find his public. Even though he's trying to be truer. Oh yeah, here we go. It's not for my wives, my daughters, or my sisters that this book has been written, nor for the wives, daughters, or sisters of my neighbors. I leave that to those who have some reason to confuse good deeds with fine language. All right, so here's a point of contact we might see with Gautier. Namely, Gautier, the preface to Mademoiselle de Maupin, he says, I wouldn't even know what it would mean to write with a moral purpose, like the art and morality or counterposed concepts. That you can't expect artists and writers to produce works of moral instruction, and you can't hold them responsible for the depiction of immoral things. So similarly, he says, confusion of good deeds with fine language would not make sense for him. He says, I know the passionate lover of fine style exposes himself to the hatred of the masses. But no respect for humanity, no false modesty, no conspiracy, no universal suffrage will ever force me to speak the unspeakable jargon of this age or to confuse ink with virtue. Certain illustrious poets have long since divided among themselves the more flowery provinces of the realm of poetry. He says, I have found it amusing and the more pleasant because the task was more difficult to extract beauty from evil. This book, which is quintessentially useless and absolutely innocent, was written with no other aim than to divert myself and to practice my passionate taste for the difficult. Some have told me that these poems might do harm. I have not rejoiced at that. Others, good souls, that they might do good, and that has given me no regret. I was equally surprised at the former's fear and the latter's hope, which only served to prove once again that this age has unlearned all the classical notions of literature. Despite the encouragement of a few celebrated pedants have given to man's natural stupidity, I should never have believed our country could move with such speed along the road of progress. The world has taken on a thickness of vulgarity that raises a spiritual man's contempt to the violence of a passion. But there are those happy hides so thick that poison itself could not penetrate them. I had intended at first to answer numerous criticisms and at the same time to explain quite few simple questions that have been totally obscured by the modern Enlightenment. What is poetry? What is its aim? On the distinction between the good and the beautiful, on the beauty and evil, that rhythm and rhyme answered the immortal need in man for monotony, symmetry, and surprise, on adapting style to subject, on the vanity and danger of inspiration, etc., etc. But this morning I was so rash as to read some of the public newspapers. Suddenly an indolence of the weight of 20 atmospheres fell upon me, and I was stopped, faced by the appalling uselessness of explaining anything whatever to anyone whatever. Those who know can divine me, and for those who cannot or will not understand, it would be fruitless to pile up explanations. All right. Let's take a short break and then we'll get into more of the details of Benjamin's essay. Let's take about 5 or 10 minutes. Resume. All right, so actually want to turn to Paris, capital of the 19th century. So this is the revised version of what's known as the Exposé on the Arcades project. So the Arcades project is this long book project that Benjamin never completed. He never realized it. So what we have from the Arcades project are really 2 essays. So the essay that we read on Baudelaire, the Paris of the Second Empire in Baudelaire, but then we also have, there's another essay that he wrote on Baudelaire called On some Motifs in Baudelaire. And we also have his project proposals, basically, the 1935 version and the 1939 version. Now, the reading that we're doing next week on the concept of history is his draft methodological introduction to the book, to this Arcades project book that he never wrote. So he was writing it as a history of the 19th century, and specifically he was looking at the history of the 19th century as a foreshadowing of the 20th century. So the idea is that the failure of the revolution in 1848 brought about the Second Empire and Bonapartism. Similarly, the failure of the revolution at the end of World War I succeeded in Russia, but in a kind of paradoxical way, but failed outside of Russia, had given birth to fascism in the 20th century. So the idea was that the 20th century was repeating the 19th century, but maybe in worse form, but that also meant that something essential had been revealed in the 19th century that was merely repeating in the 20th. So On the Concept of History is his kind of historiographical, methodological introduction for how he was approaching history. So we'll see what that means next week. And then we have the two versions of these exposés, which are a series of mini essays or almost aphoristic treatments of different phenomena of the 19th century that he thought captured its essence. One of the main revisions between the 1935 and 1939 versions is he added an introduction and an epilogue, and he uses some language here that is not in the 1935 version that I want to call attention to, but also in the context of what he's saying. So let's look at what he says. He says, history is like Janus. It has two faces. Whether it looks at the past or at the present, it sees the same things. That's his epigraph from Maxime Duchamp. The subject of this book, Benjamin writes, is an illusion expressed by Schopenhauer in the following formula. To seize the essence of history, it suffices to compare Herodotus and the morning newspaper. So Herodotus, who's one of the chroniclers of classical antiquity, and the morning newspaper, journalism today. What is expressed here is a feeling of vertigo, characteristic of the 19th century's conception of history. It corresponds to a viewpoint according to which the course of the world is an endless series of facts congealed in the form of things. The characteristic residue of this conception is what has been called the history of civilization, which makes an inventory point by point of humanity's life forms and creations. The riches thus amassed in the aerarium of civilization henceforth appear as though identified for all time. This conception of history minimizes the fact that such riches owe not only their existence, but also their transmission to a constant effort of society, an effort, moreover, by which these riches are strangely altered. Our investigation proposes to show how, as a consequence of this reifying representation of civilization, the new forms of behavior and the new economically and technologically based creations that we owe to the 19th century enter the universe of a phantasmagoria. That's our key word that we're going to look at. These creations undergo this illumination not only in a theoretical manner by an ideological transposition, but also in the immediacy of their perceptible presence. They are manifest as phantasmagorias. Thus appeared the arcades, first entry in the field of iron construction. Thus appear the world exhibitions, whose link to the entertainment industry is significant. Also included in this order of phenomena is the experience of the flaneur, who abandons himself to the phantasmagorias of the marketplace. Corresponding to these phantasmagorias of the market, where people appear only as types, are the phantasmagorias of the interior, which are constituted by man's imperious need to leave the imprint of his private individual existence on the rooms he inhabits. As for the phantasmagorias of civilization itself, it found its champion in Haussmann, and its manifest expression in his transformation of Paris, again, the boulevard architecture. Nevertheless, the pomp and the splendor with which commodity-producing society surrounds itself, as well as its illusory sense of security, are not immune to dangers. The collapse of the Second Empire and the Commune of Paris reminded of that. In the same period, the most dreaded adversary of this society, Blanqui, revealed to it in his last piece of writing the terrifying features of this phantasmagoria. Humanity figures there as damned. Everything new it could hope for turns out to be a reality that has always been present. And this newness will be as little capable of furnishing it with a liberating solution as a new fashion is capable of rejuvenating society. Blanqui's cosmic speculation conveys this lesson that humanity will be prey to a mythic anguish so long as phantasmagoria occupies a place in it. Now I'll say something else about the Haussmann architecture of the new Paris. So we looked at Caillebotte. So the painting of his. All right, so we looked at the rainy day. So this is a similar part of town, similar boulevards, but this is a young man at his window. So he's looking out onto the street. So you can see he's looking at a woman on the street in the distance. And he is standing in the shadow of the aperture of the window in the building. So presumably any number of people can be at their window in these apartment blocks, also looking down the street in the same way. All right, so he's sort of at the threshold of interior private space and exterior public space. There's also the young woman at the window. Let's see if they have that. They should. Wait, some of these are not. Oh yeah, okay, that's Sky Boat. All right. Yes, here we go. Ding. All right, young woman at the window. Similar apartment block, but of course very different. So here, the window is closed, and she's looking out, and maybe someone is looking out from their window across the way. And she's in the space, almost sort of trapped in this space, by contrast with the two. He has this commanding look out onto the street. All right, so she's more sort of closed within herself, looking out the window. Although perhaps the young man is too. All right, so what is this word phantasmagoria? It's actually from Marx, and it's an English word, and it sort of disappears from the English translation of Marx's Das Kapital, from his Fetishism of Commodities chapter or section of chapter 1 of volume 1 of Das Kapital. So what is a phantasmagoria? It's a carnival attraction. It's a carnival entertainment. It's where we get the term smoke and mirrors from. It's also known as a lantern show, like a magic lantern show. So basically, it's the charm of it is that there's smoke, and then there's light projected into the smoke, and you can't distinguish between something that is backlit as a silhouette and a projected shadow of an object. So there's a kind of interplay of shadows and objects that are backlit in silhouette. And so the optical illusions are you're trying to figure out, okay, what's an actual object and what's the projected shadow of an object, and how are they interacting with each other. So here's the paragraph from Marx. A commodity is therefore a mysterious thing simply because in it the social character of men's labor appears to them as an objective character stamped upon the product of that labor, because the relation of the producers to the sum total of their labor is presented to them as a social relation, existing not between themselves, but between the products of their labor. This is the reason why the products of labor become commodities, social things whose qualities are at the same time perceptible and imperceptible by the senses. In the same way, the light from an object is perceived by us not as the subjective excitation of our optic nerve, but as the objective form of something outside the eye itself. But in the act of seeing, there is at all events an actual passage of light from one thing to another, from the external object to the eye. There is a physical relation between physical things, but it is different with commodities. There the existence of the things as commodities, and the value relation between the products of labor which stamps them as commodities, have absolutely no connection with their physical properties and with the material relations arising therefrom. There it is a definite social relation between men that assumes, in their eyes, the phantasmagorical form of a relation between things. So it's not a fantastic form, that would be like a kind of fantasy. No, it's the phantasmagorical form of a relation between things. In order, therefore, to find an analogy, we must have recourse to the mist-enveloped regions of the religious world. In that world, the productions of the human brain appear as independent beings endowed with life, and enter into relation both with one another and the human race. So it is in the world of commodities with the products of men's hands. This I call the fetishism which attaches itself to the products of labor. so soon as they are produced as commodities, and which is therefore inseparable from the production of commodities. The fetishism of commodities has its origin, as the foregoing analysis has already shown, in the peculiar social character of the labor that produces them. Okay, so again, in the English translation, they scrub out the word phantasmagorical, even though actually it's an English word that he put into the German, and then it's lost in the English translation. So anyway, but fetishism here, it's not like a sexual fetish in the kind of Freudian psychoanalytic sense of a substitute object or a displaced gratification, but it's fetish in the anthropological sense. When Marx was writing before Freud, he's not thinking of it as a psychological phenomenon or as an erotic object phenomenon, but rather as a phenomenon of religion, the earliest form of culture in anthropological terms, animism, fetish objects. Right, so the modern world thinks of itself as secular and scientific, but it has its own fetishism. And what is that fetishism? The fetishism of labor. The fetishism of labor as the source of all wealth, and wealth in the form of commodities. Right, so it's the bourgeois social relations to others, to nature, and to ourselves through our labor that has become our fetish. Now, there's another, let me see if I can find this quickly. Hold on a second. It's in our letter from Adorno to Benjamin, but I wanted the sort of pithy quotation version of it in response to his essay on the Paris of the Second Empire in Baudelaire. Okay, here's the found the pithy quote version. Let's see. All right, this is Adorno's letter to Benjamin. That's kind of critical of his essay. He says, the fetish character of the commodity is not a fact of consciousness. Rather, it is dialectical in the eminent sense that it produces consciousness. Perfection of the commodity character in a Hegelian self-consciousness inaugurates the explosion of its phantasmagoria. Okay, so what does this mean? It means the fetishism of commodities is not just a way that we think about things. In fact, it's a way that we're actually doing things that produces our consciousness. And so it's actually our practical reality. Like the fetishism of so-called primitive peoples, or like religion of ancient peoples, we have our own fetish. Just as for them it was a self-evident reality, so is the social relations of labor for us. It's what we just take for granted. It's our practical reality and not just merely what we think. But to become self-conscious of this, right, to become self-conscious of commodity fetishism means that it's already kind of exploding, meaning it's no longer a kind of transparent, self-evident thing, but it's this smoke and mirrors, kind of mysterious domain of the phantasmagoria. So the idea is that the Industrial Revolution has made visible to us our own fetishism and our social relations. So the Industrial Revolution has led us to become aware of what we otherwise completely naturalize and take for granted. Namely, the fetishism of commodities, which is really the fetishism of labor. And so commodity fetishism is not like shop till you drop. It's not like consumerism. That isn't the point. The point is that we give a kind of metaphysical and even sacred kind of reverential quality to our labor. The Protestant work ethic. This is like the highest value that we have in this society. The purpose of our existence is to work. Even though the Industrial Revolution has opened up the possibility that we could transcend that. And because of that possibility that we could transcend it, our kind of self-evident reality is exploding. It's no longer transparent, but it's rather become a phantasmagoria. But because it's a phantasmagoria, it means that we can't distinguish between object and shadow. We can't distinguish between cause and effect. We tend to reverse means and ends. To get back to the language of Lukács, the phenomenon of reification that we read earlier in the semester. All right, but again, from this Marxist view that Benjamin has, the fact that we can be aware of the phantasmagoria means that we can actually change it. We could end it. But once society appears in this form, it's no longer the Enlightenment of the 18th century, but it's rather this strange smoke and mirrors, mist-enveloped region of the 19th century, or the phantasmagoria, to use Benjamin's language. So let's see how he concludes this project proposal for the Arcades project. Men of the 19th century, the hour of our apparitions is fixed forever and always brings us back to the very same ones. During the Commune, so that is the uprising that takes place at the end of the Franco-Prussian War, where the French surrender to the Germans. So Louis Bonaparte attacks Germany. The Germans quickly defeat him. They arrest him on the battlefield. They invade France and occupy France. And as part of the surrender of France to the invading German army, they surrender Paris. However, the people of Paris rise up and refuse to be occupied by the Germans. And they establish a kind of radical city government. And it's the Paris Commune or the Commune of Paris, but that's just the name of any municipal government in France. So any municipal government is called the Commune of this, the Commune of that. But it is led by socialists and communists. It's led by mostly anarchists, but also by these followers of Auguste Blanqui, who's the famous kind of revolutionary conspirator socialist of the mid-19th century, who spends a lot of time in jail in the Second Empire. During the Commune, Blanqui was held prisoner in the fortress of Toureau. It was there that he wrote his Eternity via the Stars. This book completes the century's constellation of phantasmagorias with one last cosmic phantasmagoria, which implicitly comprehends the severest critique of all the others. The ingenuous reflection of an autodidact, which form the principal portion of this work, open the way to merciless speculations that give the lie to the author's revolutionary elan. The conception of the universe which Blanqui develops in his book, taking his basic premises from the mechanistic natural sciences, proves to be a vision of hell. It is, moreover, the complement of that society which Blanqui, near the end of his life, was forced to admit had defeated him. The irony of this scheme, an irony which doubtless escaped the author himself, is that the terrible indictment he produces against society takes the form of an unqualified submission to its results. Blanqui's book presents the idea of eternal return 10 years before Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra, in a manner scarcely less moving than that of Nietzsche, and with an extreme hallucinatory power. This power is anything but triumphant. It leaves, on the contrary, a feeling of oppression. Blanqui here strives to trace an image of progress that immemorial antiquity parading as up-to-date novelty turns out to be the phantasmagoria of history itself. Here is the essential passage. The entire universe is composed of astral systems. To create them, nature has only 100 simple bodies at its disposal. That's the periodic table of elements. Despite the great advantage it derives from these resources and the innumerable combinations that these resources afford its fecundity, the result is necessarily a finite number, like that of the elements themselves. And in order to fill its expanse, nature must repeat to infinity each of its original combinations or types. So each heavenly body, whatever it might be, exists in infinite number in time and space, not only in one of its aspects, but as it is at each second of its existence from birth till death. The earth is one of these heavenly bodies. Every human being is thus eternal at every second of his or her existence. What I write at this moment in a cell in the Fort de Toureau, I have written and shall write throughout all eternity. At a table with a pen, clothed as I am now, in circumstances like these, and thus it is for everyone. The number of our doubles is infinite in time and space. One cannot in good conscience demand anything more. These doubles exist in flesh and bone, indeed in trouser and jacket, in crinoline and chignon. They are by no means phantoms. They are the present eternalized. Here, nonetheless, lies a great drawback. There is no progress. What we call progress is confined to each particular world and vanishes with it. Always and everywhere in the terrestrial arena, the same drama, the same setting, on the same narrow stage. A noisy humanity infatuated with its own grandeur, believing itself to be the universe and living in its prison, as though in some immense realm, only to founder at an early date along with its globe, which has borne with deepest disdain the burden of human arrogance. The same monotony, the same immobility on other heavenly bodies. The universe repeats itself endlessly and paws the ground in place. In infinity, eternity performs imperturbably the same routines. This resignation without hope is the last word of the great revolutionary. The century was incapable of responding to the new technological possibilities with a new social order. That is why the last word was left to the errant negotiators between old and new who are at the heart of these phantasmagorias. The world dominated by its phantasmagorias, this, to make use of a Baudelaire's term, is modernity. Blanqui's vision has the entire universe, entering the modernity of which Baudelaire's 7 old men are the heralds. In the end, Blanqui views novelty as an attribute of all that is under sentence of damnation. Likewise, in Heaven and Hell, a vaudeville piece that slightly predates the book, in this piece, the torments of hell figure as the latest novelty of all time, as pains eternal and always new. The people of the 19th century, whom Blanqui addresses as if they were apparitions, are natives of this region. Okay, so that's capitalism. It gives rise to this kind of hellish cosmology. Here's an example. I think it's in this. It might be in the 1935 version. Oh no, we have Grandeville. Okay, so if you know, I think it's Pierre. Might not be though. No, it's not. It is, what is his name? J.J. Grandeville. So Jean-Jacques Grandeville. Okay, so let's look at some of the Grandeville. So he's the great illustrator of the mid-19th century. He illustrated some popular literature like Alice in Wonderland. But then he also did some other things. So we're going to look at some of his more spooky illustrations. If they have them on, oh yeah, I like this one. Here's a scary one. So this is your undersea creatures, your molluscoid sea urchins in various shapes, in various anthropomorphic shapes, including like a hellish, like a horse-drawn carriage. Right, so all the kind of anthropoid, molluscoid forms are fleeing in terror from the great mouth of the beast that's about to consume them. Let's see if we can find. Does he have the apocalyptic ballet? Let's see if they have that here. Well, we have this, which Benjamin talks about. This is the idea that in the future, the architecture on Earth will like span the different planets in the solar system, and that you can go strolling from planet to planet. That's a good one. We got this one where we have the fish who are fishing for people with consumer products. And, like various rewards, including like a civilian award for accomplishments. Let's see. No. All right. Let's see. There it is. Okay. Oops. This is the apocalyptic ballet. So this is the kind of fairy ballet dancer in the middle who is spinning and turning into a spool of thread, but also her stockings are taking on a life of their own. Right, and then they're transforming into these things. So we have the clapping hands, the lobster claws, the pallets with which to remove bread from the oven, bottles for wine, the goblets, and then a kind of hourglass. And then we also have becomes kind of writing, which becomes sort of messenger dogs, and then the stockings become the Sacred Heart. That's like the Catholic imagery. And you get the marriage license, and you get the incense. Two kinds of incense, the religious incense and the sort of more decorative incense. And the shaving cream. Yeah. And then it also turns into gold, which become wedding rings, which become hearts. Right, so this gives us some imagery for the phantasmagorias of the 19th century. Let's see what else they've got here. Oh, they got a different version of this one. This might be a clearer. Yeah, this is a clearer image than we had before. That's the one that I find the most sort of disturbing. The most sort of sad and terrifying at the same time. All right, so this is the world that capitalism presents itself as. Okay. All right. Let me turn back to your notes. So Longyou, you have some discussion of the Paris of the Second Empire essay.
Yeah, I think it's the long one.
It's not. It's a. Yeah, we looked at this one, but let's go back to the long essay. Oh my goodness. Yeah, these pages are all. Let me turn this one back around, and then I'll download it. Open it. Then we can do this. Okay. Like I said, this essay has the three sections: the Bohème, the Flaneur, and Modernity.
Yeah, I guess I have two questions, but one of them you have sort of already answered at the beginning of the class. So I kind of is thinking about whether or not there's a politics again. And you kind of said that he was doing that lyrical poetry, but sort of when it was the most banal or profane phenomenon in the world. So I kind of figured it out. And another question is regarding like all the identities, like the poet sort of takes up like somewhere in the essay that
His models for
Yeah,
for the role of the poet or the artist.
yes, whatever they are. I was like, they're sort of like individualists, like
Mm-hmm.
alone, like isolated. And I was like wondering, is that the kind of influence from romanticism, or is it like actually a modern phenomenon?
It comes from romanticism for sure, but then it's given a kind of new twist or a new kind of exacerbation in the capitalist era. So on the one hand, the flaneur, the Apache, who we talked about, the dandy, the rag picker. So let's look at the rag picker as a okay, here we go. Got two poems we should look at in this selection, and the rag picker is one. So what is a rag picker? He's someone who collects things out of the trash of the rich, and then he sells them to the poor. So secondhand clothes. It's actually it's still a huge market in the world economy today. So a lot of things that we throw away end up being used again in the poorer parts of the world. So in this instance, it's about, so the rag picker would go from the suburbs into the city to pick the trash and then back out to the suburbs to sell what he finds. Often in some red street lamp's glare, whose flame the wind flaps, rattling at its glassy frame, in the mired labyrinth of some old slum, where crawling multitudes ferment their scum, with judge-like nods a rag picker comes reeling, bumping on walls like poets without feeling. And scorning cops, now vassals of his state, begins on glorious subjects to dilate. Takes royal oaths, dictates his laws sublime, exalts the injured and chastises crime, and spreading his own dais on the sky, is dazzled by his virtues starred on high. Yes, these folk, badgered by domestic care, ground down by toil, decrepitude, despair, buckled beneath the foul load that each carries, the motley vomit of enormous Paris. So again, the idea of the secondhand, like the trash that's going to be sold on the secondary market is like a vomit of the city. Come home, vat-scented, trailing clouds of glory, followed by veteran comrades, battle-hoary, whose whiskers stream like banners as each marches, flags, torches, flowers, and steep triumphal arches. Rise up for them in magic hues and burn, since through this dazzling orgy they return, while drums and clarions daze the sun above with glory to a nation drunk with love. Thus wine through giddy human life is rolled, like Pactolus, a stream of burning gold. Through man's own throat his exploits it will sing, and reign by gifts as best befits a king. So what he's talking about here is you get drunk and you throw up, right? So like the poet is like regurgitating and kind of vomiting. So the oration of the lyric poet is like the vomiting of the drunken rag picker. To lull their laziness and drown their rancor, for storm-tossed wrecks a temporary anchor, God in remorse made sleep. Man added wine, child of the sun, immortal and divine. All right, so poetry or any art is like a secondhand experience. It's a used experience, it's a secondhand object, and also it is a pre-digested object. It's a vomited object. It's a regurgitated object. It's a regurgitated experience. It's a pre-digested experience. But it's also an intoxication. Right, so it's and intoxicants are things that affect you because they're kind of poisoning you but not killing you, basically. Right, so again, art, poetry is like any intoxicant. It's actually harmful, and that's where it gets its effects from, but it doesn't actually kill you. We looked at this poem previously, Beauty, when we were looking at the selections from the Paris Spleen. But let's look at To a Passerby, which is another poem that Benjamin quotes in the essay. Amid the deafening traffic of the town, tall, slender, in deep mourning, with majesty, a woman passed, raising with dignity in her poised hand the flounces of her gown. Graceful, noble, with a statue's form, and I drank, trembling as a madman thrills, from her eyes, ashen sky where a brooded storm, the softness that fascinates, the pleasure that kills, a flash, then night, O lovely fugitive, I am suddenly reborn from your swift glance, shall I never see you till eternity? Somewhere far off, too late, never perchance, neither knows where the other goes or lives. We might have loved, and you knew this might be. All right, so this is a kind of paradigmatic experience of modernity. Again, being part of the anonymous crowd in the city. You're constantly seeing people who you don't know and won't ever know. You're constantly encountering strangers in this kind of anonymous reality. But what he's doing here, notice there's a kind of a projection and an identification going on between him and the woman he's encountering on the street. So he perceives her as mourning. He also perceives her as returning his gaze, but maybe she isn't. Maybe she is, maybe she isn't. It's sort of ambiguous. And he is seeing in her barely met glance all of this. He's sort of projecting. Right, so it's this kind of tormented encounter whose power is connected with its impossibility. So, I am suddenly reborn from your swift glance, but shall I never see you till eternity? We might have loved, and you knew this might be. So it ends with a kind of accusation. I think Longyu, you have you mentioned the daily shocks and conflicts of civilization, right? So, so one of the things that Baudelaire thematizes in his poetry is like shocks, the shocks of urban life, the shocks of daily experience in the modern city. In Kantian aesthetics, the description of beauty is that it is the sympathetic resonance of subject and object. So it's when the subject feels a kind of kinship with the object, and the object appears to be more than it is, appears to be alive in a way that it's not. He describes, by contrast, Kant describes the sublime as an experience of pain that is pleasurable because it threatens to overwhelm you, but it doesn't actually overwhelm you. So it's kind of a threshold experience of pain that because you are not overwhelmed by it, you take pleasure in it. When we read The Artist's Confiteor from the Paris Spleen by Baudelaire, he describes beauty as a dual, right? That the creation of art out of the beautiful is a dual between the artist and his subject, where the artist shrieks in terror before succumbing, before being overwhelmed. And that's another way that Kant described the sublime, which is that it threatens to be terrifying, but is not actually terrifying, because terror would be a state of being overwhelmed. It's rather the taming of the terrifying to the merely fearful. So again, it's a pain that's not overwhelming you, and so you take pleasure in it. It's something that's fearful, that threatens to be terrifying, but doesn't actually overwhelm you, isn't actually terrifying, and you take pleasure in that. So you're taking pleasure in the power of your own subjectivity to not be overwhelmed by what threatens to be a painful or terrifying experience. So the reason that Kant distinguished between the beautiful and the sublime, it was an established distinction already in aesthetic discourse before Kant's time, but he's interpreting it because he's interpreting the two aspects of aesthetic pleasure. One, the pleasure that we take from objects, the other, the pleasure that we take from forces, from energy, from more dynamic experiences. So he associates beauty with objects and the sublime with forces. And in Romanticism, the sublime gets a little bit of an upper hand over the beautiful as the kind of paradigmatic experience of art that art seeks to capture and convey. I don't know if we looked at the Caspar David Friedrich. Did we talk about that at all? With the sublime, we did not. Okay, you guys know this painting, of course. This famous painting. This is usually seen as a depiction of the sublime experience, right? Because, of course, where this person depicted in the painting is situated, he's standing confidently, whereas actually be clinging on for bare life and terror. And really, there's not much visually to this painting, so it's not like a visual experience. It's more of a psychological or emotional experience that's conveyed. And so what you get is just the sort of barest amount of depiction to suggest the kind of experience that the painting is trying to reproduce. And also the fact that he's dead center in the painting, and the painting therefore is this kind of vertiginous void that is opening up in front of him, but he's also taming. He's also sort of organizing and mastering the composition of the painting. And again, the viewer is not occupying the subject position of the person in the painting, but it's just giving you the suggestion of what it must be like to be where he is. And so one thing that also characterizes Romanticism is that it's not giving you the actual experience, it's pointing to the experience that art can't actually fully deliver. So it's sort of suggesting to the imagination an experience that the work of art can itself provide. Now why this is important is that, of course, Baudelaire is doing something different. So he is transcending Romanticism in the sense that he's actually trying to reproduce the experience through his poetry. And then, of course, the modernist visual artists are also trying to not just suggest, not just point to, but actually, physically through the plastic arts, the actual experience. Like it is supposed to have a kind of more visceral, direct impact. That Romanticism sort of despaired of. Sort of thought that the romantic experience of art is that art had lost its power to do that, and could only sort of deliver kind of an idea or a virtual kind of representation of something rather than the actual experience. So again, what Baudelaire is seeking to do is capture the essence of modernity through its characteristic experience. And that's the experience of city life. That's the experience of the big city of industrial capitalism. And the experience of the big city of industrial capitalism is one of ceaseless shocks. especially the city itself, like meaning the street. So on the one hand, people are walking around numbed to their experience, because if you were fully in contact with everything going on around you, you'd be overwhelmed by it. Right? So you have to be kind of numbed to it. At the same time, then, modern people seek stimulation to counteract the numbing that they have to impose upon themselves in order to live. So in order to sort of manage the experience of everyday life in capitalism, we have to numb ourselves, but then we seek entertainments with which to overcome our numbing ourselves. So we look in art for shocking experiences that we've numbed ourselves against in reality. Right, and that the shock is more of an interior experience than an exterior experience. Meaning what art can do is shock the sensibility or the imagination. It can't as easily like actually shock the senses or viscerally shock the body. Although of course artists have tried to do that too. And popular entertainment has even tried to do that to some extent. So to have a kind of authentic imagination or authentic subjective sensibility actually means shocking that subjectivity. Baudelaire set the model for surrealism in the 20th century. So the surrealists tried to be the Baudelaires of the 20th century. They took from Baudelaire the idea of convulsive beauty. So something is beautiful when it makes you convulse. Again, this kind of other strange mixture of the beautiful and the sublime. So the object that's beautiful makes you convulse, shocks you. And then the internalization of that's the dandy, the man of the crowd who tries to like immerse himself or herself in the crowd, also sort of imitates that shock. So kind of personifies, embodies that shock. Let me just show you guys some images of Baudelaire. I don't know if we looked at this painting before. This is a great painting of Baudelaire by Courbet. I don't think that we looked at this. So this is a great portrait of Baudelaire by Courbet, where there's his face is kind of soft focus, sort of not rendered sharply. So what is rendered with more detail are the hand on the couch that's sort of a little bit tense, the pipe that he's smoking, the book that he's reading, and the pen that he might be writing with. Right, so those are the centers of his attention. And then he himself, his own form, is more mutely rendered. Anyway, that painting is good, but actually I was looking to this, I guess. There's another painting of Baudelaire, but I don't think that I'm finding it. Oh, actually, this one. This is a good one. Oops. This is nonsense. Oh, this is what always happens with when you do an image search. You get this kind of like, they're trying to sell you the print of a reproduction. This is a younger Baudelaire. His hand is out of control. Right. So on the one hand, he's like very relaxed and kind of composed. On the other hand, he's but the photographs. Actually, the other day in another class, I was trying to find a photograph of Baudelaire. I feel like. Yeah, I was having the same problem when I was trying to find an image of Baudelaire the other day, which is that actually the images seem a lot more kind of humane and soft and kind of like, he looks like a normal person, as opposed to like a total freakazoid on the street, like into the passerby. I guess this is the photo that's most famous of Baudelaire. Yes, so convulsive beauty. Now, key phrase in the Paris, the Second Empire in Baudelaire. Benjamin writes, "Here it is the commodity itself that speaks." Here it is the commodity itself that speaks. And why the prostitute would be a model for the poet is because the prostitute is also doing what we would now call emotional or affective labor. You know this phrase? Meaning the artist is like the prostitute in that they're marketing or commodifying feeling. And so he wants, the way Benjamin puts it is that the commodity is the most empathic thing because it's in search of a buyer. So whereas the flaneur is treating the crowd as a spectacle, he says that in Victor Hugo, the crowd, the city, society is treated as a spectacle to be contemplated, whereas for Baudelaire, by contrast, the city, the crowd, society, the masses are this kind of force field that the poet is thrown into. Kind of force field of energy that the poet's thrown into and immersed in. The anonymity of the crowd. So the man of the crowd is anonymous, like all the members of the crowd. I mentioned Edgar Allan Poe in The Detective Story as a model of entertainment literature in the 19th century. So in the detective novel, all of reality is turned into a kind of field of forensic investigation. So everyone is potentially a criminal, everyone's a suspect, and everyone's also a detective. One of the things he raises is the physiognomy. This is another kind of weird 19th century phenomenon, the physiognomy. So that's a little like popular, it's like a book that people carry around that has different facial characteristics. And then you're supposed to know the character of a person by their physiognomy, by their faces. So dealing with strangers, how do people deal with strangers, and especially in the marketplace, they refer to their physiognomy. They're like, okay, wait a second, can I trust this guy? Right? So again, everyone is a suspect, but everyone's a detective. Everyone's potentially a criminal, but also everyone's an investigator. Everyone's a detective. But that's what life in the modern city of industrial capitalism is. And one lives one's own life as if moving through a crime scene, either as perpetrator or victim, either as target of investigation or investigator. So the crime drama, the detective novel, this is a venerable genre of capitalism. Believe it or not, it didn't exist before the industrial era. Right. Okay. So well, you mentioned the isolated individual, right? The kind of what we would now call in 20th century sociological terms, the atomized individual, is also originating in this era. Right. So this kind of disparity between the individual and the collective. So the crowd on the one hand and the atomized individual on the other hand. Mass society has its origins in the 19th century. Mass society originates in the industrial era. And it produces a specific kind of subject of experience. It's a melancholic subject, it's a traumatized subject, it's a subject in constant state of shock, anxiety, depression. Sound familiar? All right, guys. We will have our second week of Benjamin next week. We'll deal with the philosophy of history before we get into postmodernism. Kids throwing all this away. Saying, fuck it, let's just revel in it instead of trying to transform it.